Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. We are thrilled to have New York Times best-selling author Michael Koryta here with his new book. It's called How It Happened. This is a crime thriller that will be the read of the summer. Well, Michael, welcome back to Anderson's. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
And congrats on your new book, How It Happened. And this is number 13.
This is Lucky 13.
Lucky 13, yeah. And I can't believe it. Since that debut book you wrote when you were 20?
I sold it when I was 20. I wrote it when I was 19.
19.
Yes, so.
And you think 13 books in 14 years?
14 years, yeah.
That's amazing. That's incredible.
It's kind of...
You're a busy guy.
It surprises me because it doesn't feel like it's been all that long. And I guess I kind of feel like I should have 5 books out or something, but 13 seems like, wow, you have the proverbial body of work out and all this.
No, it is a body of work. And you're
it's not right up on me.
Most authors don't write that quickly, so I think that's just phenomenal. And
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
As long as people keep reading them, then I'll keep putting them out there.
If you keep reading writing books like this, there won't be any problem.
Thank you.
But I saw that you have, it's 3-starred reviews, and you got the mother lode of all reviews. You got a Star Kirkus review, which is so wonderful. So congrats on that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Great to see.
Yeah. So 14 years you've been publishing, and it's, for the first book it was Tonight I Said Goodbye. And I found an old copy that I had from 14 years ago. But how does it feel now with 13 books later from that first experience getting published? And how different is it for you now?
It feels surreal because, as I say, it went quicker than I'd anticipated. I would have thought that it would have gotten easier, the writing process, and then I discovered, like most writers do, that it doesn't. You still have the same challenges. From a business and book selling standpoint, it's been an entirely different landscape. I was looking at my first tour for Tonight I Said Goodbye. None of those stores exist anymore.
Oh wow! Yeah.
Some were indies, but there are a lot of Borders and some Barnes & Noble. So went through the rise of box stores and Amazon, and then. For me personally, being such a bookstore lover, it's been great to see. I'm coming back to some indie stores, obviously Anderson's, but then to see new stores with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm is just, that's very encouraging.
Right, that's great. And so every time a new novel comes out, do you get nervous? Because it's been out a week now.
Yes.
How it happened.
I get nervous, and I always have a goal of having at least a draft of the new one done. I know that it'll be a very rough draft, but that way, if the reviews are really bad, or I think actually the more frightening thing is it's what I've had the good fortune to experience with this one, which is great reviews, but either one can get in your head.
Sure.
And so I like to feel like the work is moving. We're already on to the next. Next step, new characters.
So, published 13 novels. I think that's writing at this pace is pretty incredible. So, this is your job. This is what you do as a job. So what do you do every morning? Do you get up? Is there a certain goal you have of how many pages or how many words you write a day?
Yeah, I do word count because I learned that I can cheat time very easily, and I can say, I'm going to do 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day, and then I can spend that on 3 sentences. Word count to me it makes sure that there's forward motion, and that keeps my subconscious engaged. I firmly believe that the subconscious understands what the book should be ahead of my conscious mind. So forward motion is good. It also it keeps the emotional highs and lows from dragging you down.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned, I was reading one of your blog posts about On Writing, Stephen King's book, which I have listened to several times on audio because I think it's a brilliant book, just a brilliant book. But I think that is so incredible. But when you think about the way you write, and did that book have a big influence on you? And were you a Stephen King fan when you were younger?
Yeah, it was. His book on writing had an enormous impact, probably before his fiction, really. I mean, I was a fan of his books, but on writing was the perfect guide, across all levels. And so I went back, and then I'm a huge fan of his fiction. Actually, today's the 22nd, so I've got his new book, and I'm reading through it, and I discovered he has a character named Koryta in it. So I appreciated that little tip of the hat.
Right,
and
very nice.
So he's Trooper John Koryta, and he
that's great.
passes some evidence along.
That's great.
Yeah, that was a thrill.
I know he's a big fan of yours, so that's very cool.
He's been very supportive.
Yeah. So how did you get into crime fiction? How did that end up being your forte when it comes to genre?
I think we all gravitate towards stories we want to read and enjoy reading, and so my father was a big film noir guy, Alfred Hitchcock, so had that background, and then I read, so it was kind of a progression of Raymond Chandler and Hammett to Connolly and Lane, and I was in love with those stories. I loved the PI characters in particular, the sort of more rogue investigators, and gravitated toward that. And then with the King influence, I ended up going towards some supernatural stuff.
Right? Yeah. So, what did you enjoy the supernatural? And are you gonna do any more supernatural in the future, or?
Yeah, I loved those stories, and I definitely you'll see me back in that.
Okay, all right, very cool, very cool. So this book, How It Happened, is set in a small town in Maine, and I know you live up in Maine part of the year.
Right.
But it's interesting that the town is a fictional town called Port Hope. Right?
Yeah.
But then I was looking it up, and Port Hope is Ontario, and that was the fictional town that they used to film it.
Someone just pointed that out
and
to me.
I thought that was so interesting. So we're back to Stephen King here.
Yeah, and I had no idea. And that town looks perfect for sort of what I'm envisioning.
Right.
So I spent time in a town called Tennant's Harbor, which is by Port Clyde. These are very tiny little fishing villages in Maine. And then, so we live in Camden. But I wanted a fictional town, and on the other side of the mountains from Camden, there's a town called Hope, and that's where we started out. And then we migrated down toward Port Clyde, so I just kind of merged the two.
Yeah.
And then, the Stephen King universe has many tentacles, I guess, because someone just told me, is this your sort of, was I winking at it?
Yeah, and was that a conscious thing or no?
Several times, and I don't remember Port Hope, but then I learned they filmed the new one.
It there, right? Yeah.
Yep.
But this town and the people in it and the way you describe it and the visualness that you put into this book, it is a character in this.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to hear that.
Oh my! And it's so incredible. So how do you make place a character, and how does it feed into story? I'm always fascinated when authors can do that so well.
I always want the setting to be in a position where it can be either friend or foe, and so. Sometimes that has been very literal. I wrote a book called Those Who Wish Me Dead, where we had forest fires involved. And at different times, the fire is an antagonist and then actually sort of a protective figure, depending how it's used. Port Hope, I liked the sort of psychological friction it brought to bear it, where if you're a seasonal resident up there, you feel like you know the place, but the locals are like, oh no, you do not know the place.
Yeah,
if you aren't here in February when the nor'easters are blowing, then you really aren't one of us. And so he sort of claims this expertise that the locals feel he doesn't actually have.
Right. So the premise of the novel, that a young couple who are in love have been murdered,
right.
And they brought in. There's an FBI agent named Rob Barrett. He's been coming, and he has spent his summers growing up in this town, which is so interesting. Now he's been sent here on this case, and he spent his summers with his grandfather. And I don't want to do any spoilers in the book, but it's interesting his interaction, because like you say, he was a summer person, right? But it's so interesting. Where did the DNA for Rob Barrett come from? Because what an interesting character, because he has some of that psychological baggage that he brings to this stuff.
I love I love haunted characters because of what you can do with the backstory, and I've always been drawn to that. But Barrett actually shifted a lot between drafts. I think we've all read so many times, and I've written so many times, the savvy veteran investigator who has this wealth of experience and is always a step ahead. And I thought it would be very interesting to, particularly for this story, to bring in a guy who only has an academic pedigree and he thinks that he is ready for the real world success, and his first big win turns into a just debacle. And writing from the novice's point of view was, to me, it was a refreshing break, because I'd written about people with experience before, and this was a guy who he's haunted by the unknown, and he wants to prove things so badly. And I could relate to that, you know, in a way, having been a reporter and a PI. I won't pretend that equates to an FBI agent's expertise, but at least I could get on the same footing of that desire to replace answers with truth.
Right. And he was an interrogation specialist, so it's interesting. It's so interesting because things happen, and like I said, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but he ends up being sent off the case.
Right. He becomes the boss of Butte. Yes.
That's right. Being sent to the Netherlands of Montana, right?
Right.
So, but it's so interesting. Well, see, I don't want to ruin the book, but he comes back because there's something in. He wants to prove himself, but also too, there's so many law enforcement when a case is unsolved. It's like an obsession that they have to figure it out.
Yeah, I think the tenacity you need to stick with, particularly a cold case. Yeah. And also, I wanted the relationship and character dynamics to really drive him. And so there's one twist in there. The moment he wants to put it away, and so he keeps ignoring these phone calls and ignoring these developments. And then there's one twist of information about who it is who actually put up the money to bail his nemesis out. And when he hears that, you know, I didn't want to put in any reaction at all. I just end the chapter, and then the opening line of the next chapter is, he returned to Maine on the first week of May. Yeah. And it made sense to me that would be the tipping point, and the reader we'd get it. Right. Emotionally, he had to go back.
And there's another character in this. It's 20-year-old Kimberly Crapo. Is that how you say it? Or Crapo?
Crapo is how.
Crapo. So. Okay. And you know, she turns herself in and says she's been involved in the murder of this couple. Right. But she's an opioid addict. You know, so she's a drug addict. But she's also one of these people that the whole town knows that never to believe anything she says. Right. So I love the way, and you do this in some of your other books too, where there's the unreliable. It could be a witness, it could be a suspect, it could be even the investigator. Some of this, it's like figuring out what the truth is and what isn't the truth. But I love the part, because there's so much going on across this country, no matter it's rural, it's in large cities, it's in the suburbs, but the opioid crisis that is just huge. And I read one of your other blogs where you talked about it. You talked about how newspapers are so important in this whole piece when we're talking about this. So talk a little bit about her and her drug addiction and how you bring that into the book.
Yeah, she actually, in some ways, became the most sympathetic character to me. Yeah. And I did a couple drafts where she was dead from page one. She existed only in the confession. And then again, sort of the subconscious, you know, I realized that was a misstep, because I wanted to watch her play off Barrett and that tension. But I was traveling back and forth between Maine and Indiana. The Portland newspaper had this fantastic series about the local victims of the epidemic up there, and then I'd come home to Bloomington, Indiana, and read, you know, the same thing, and it just really drove home how pervasive it was. And so I wanted to put a really human face on her and write her as empathetically as possible. Not sympathetic, but she has actually a kind of strange nobility among all those characters, and that there's no benefit for her to seek the truth, but she feels like it's the one thing she needs to do. And then in the midst of that, she's also dragged down by this thing that can push it all away. And when you read about the opioid epidemic, a lot of people are trying to just sort of erase their circumstances.
Yeah,
And
right.
she seemed to embody that to me.
Yeah. You know, we've had numerous deaths in the area, and there was a great series in the Daily Herald, which is a suburban newspaper that just really pointed out so much that was going on. So
Right.
newspapers are so important. So getting to that, I mean, they really are. Yeah.
It's
yeah.
ground zero of
Yeah.
information, but then as a novelist, it's inspiration. From my own experience, it was telling those stories in the community that really matter. That was a role that I felt was very sacred. I enjoyed my experience there, and I just wanted to make sure that I'm telling the people who are reading my novel that, hey, I'm getting this from small town newspapers are really doing a wonderful
Right,
job, and
right.
obviously large newspapers too.
Yeah,
but
right.
I'm more scared for newspapers right now than
for sure.
a lot of other things.
Well, and
They're
the
vital.
attacks on newspapers and their integrity and
Right.
what's real and what's
Yes,
fake.
we've
Right?
had a lot of
Yeah.
cries of fake news lately.
Oh yeah. And I think we need investigative reporting, and what newspapers do. It's
Yeah.
essential for our society.
And I feel like we have the heroes of the next few years could end up being journalists, could end up being reporters.
Oh, for sure. So, in some of your books lately, and Ron is one of these characters where men who they have trauma or something in childhood or something within their lives, and they have this anger and this rage just waiting for something, and it's so interesting. So, without saying anything about Rob, because we don't want to give away some of the stuff that happens in the book, but the psychological stuff that you put in makes your book so much more meaty to read.
Oh, I appreciate
and I think instead of reading a book where it's all plot driven, there's so much more to think about.
I appreciate hearing it.
And
That's
is that
always
something
the
you
goal.
really work at, to get that in there, to make it? It's sort of you can read crime novels, but when you read something like this, it makes you think about more than just what's happening in the story itself.
Yeah, to me the goal in crime fiction, you should be bumping up against the goals of literary fiction as frequently as possible, and part of that is I want a story where the plot is sort of the external look at the character's internal crisis, and if we can take the events of the plot to find that psychological or emotional weakness of the character and blend them together, then I feel like I'm hopefully delivering a richer read for the audience.
Yeah, because it's not only it's great that way for your mind, but it's also you're combining it with a book you're going to read in one sitting. You're on the edge of your seat, and you're just going to keep turning the pages.
I hope so.
I mean, it's a perfect storm of a great read. So,
Well, thank you. That's certainly the goal.
Do you ever find yourself, though, with these psychological issues with your characters or the story itself, that you end up going down a little bit of that dark hole?
That's a great question, and absolutely. There are scenes in that book. To discuss them would be spoilers, but that I carried with me. And I wrote a book called The Prophet, which is about two brothers and their response to the death of their sister. And one of those brothers, Adam Austin, is a very haunted man. And I realized I knew what his choice was as I got toward the end of the book. And I began to feel... I took that with me. I felt sad and kind of weary when I would leave the desk, and it took me a while to figure out why. And it's because you attach, you spend a year or 2 years with these characters.
Right.
If you're doing it right, I think you do attach to what they're feeling, and need to figure out some way to leave that aside, so your wife doesn't turn on you and chase you out of the house. So.
Right. So it's a point of whether you're going to go down the deep hole or you're going to resolve it for yourself, and maybe not necessarily within the story.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. The darkness in your books. There is darkness. There's darkness in most of them. And you think about it, you could really go overboard on that.
Mm-hmm.
So is that a fine line, not to go over with that, and that
it absolutely is, and it's one I hope I'm managing to walk that line, but I feel like there are a couple books where I probably missed and skewed a little bit too far toward toward the darkness. Trying to leaven it with, a sense of humor and just the characters and setting that remind you of beauty and hope.
Right.
Are very important to me, and particularly right now, I feel like, not to get too political here, but we're so polarized, we're so beaten down by bleakness that when you pick up a novel, I want to be able to tell you a serious and dark story, but one that you can take some joy and hope from reading too, and not just continue to,
exactly.
pound away on negatives.
Right, and I think this book definitely has that part in it. Yeah, it
I
really
can
does.
do
So Matthias Burke,
Yes.
one of those, and we all know those people. They're on varying degrees. The upstanding member of the community, but they have that other side to them.
Yeah.
Whether it's a very dark side or maybe it's just not so up and up. So where did, and we don't want to give any more spoilers.
Yeah.
But where did his DNA come from? That you put this character together.
I was looking, and this is where we get back to. You made the great comment before about character, place as character. And Matthias seems to me to be the embodiment of a community where they rely on these seasonal visitors. And the seasonal visitors, in many cases, can have a tendency to take the locals for granted, and then also to pass themselves off as locals. And it was familiar to me both from my time spent in Maine, but then also I grew up in a college town, and so we had the town and gown thing. And that without the large university, you'd have an entirely different town, and the lack of culture, all of the opportunity that it brings is great. But in August, when they come back, if you grew up there, if you're a townie, it's always, oh no, here they come.
Yeah, right.
And so I thought that was a psychology I could explore with at least some knowledge of first-hand experience.
For sure. So you were a newspaper reporter.
Yes.
But also too, I was fascinated that you had an internship in high school working with a private investigator.
Yeah, and that turned into a part-time job, and actually that was my full-time job until I went to Little Brown with So Cold the River.
Right.
And so that was, I didn't even have a driver's license yet. And my school had a program called Independent Study.
Oh, that
and I
is so
called
cool.
I just opened, back in the good old days of the phone book, the Yellow Pages, we had 3 listings for private investigators, and I called in alphabetical order. The first person politely declined, the second one just hung up on me, and then the third, it was Trace Investigations, and the investigator's name is Don Johnson, which is fantastic PI credibility right there.
It is. Don Johnson.
He suggested we meet at a coffee shop downtown, and I said, okay. And then I took a bus down and didn't mention to him that I didn't have a driver's license and couldn't really contribute yet, but he was great to me, and I learned so much for that.
That was so cool when you were in high school.
Such a grist for the mill job.
Yeah, so doing it in high school and then also doing it for your day job for a while, what were some of the most interesting or bizarre cases that you worked on, either with Don Johnson or on your own?
Well, bizarre, there was no shortage. I mean, just kind of the funny anecdotes, I could go on forever. A favorite involves someone who was hiding in the bushes running a video camera, and an Amish construction worker, they were doing like a framing on a home. He came by and urinated on those bushes while she was in there. So I always found that one particularly hilarious because it wasn't me. The more profound, I worked a lot of custody cases. Indiana was a no-fault divorce state. And when you saw children's lives at stake, ideally you felt like your client was in the right. Sometimes you felt like these kids just had no parent either way. And I worked a wrongful death case involving a child that was just, that was one that really stuck with me. So
I imagine.
it was, it had good days, bad days, funny days, sad days, but you couldn't ask for a better education as a writer.
No kidding, yeah. And what fodder for all of this, and to really be on the ground and seeing this, it's incredible. So what is your earliest recollection of wanting to be a writer, or you got your degree in criminal justice, so what was that first? Do you remember that first time when you were young, when you thought you wanted to be a writer or maybe work in law enforcement?
I was 8 years old. I started writing letters to my favorite children's authors.
Oh.
And
who were some of those authors?
So there was one who my father recommended to me. It was a writer named Keith Robertson, who wrote these books in the 50s and 60s. So my dad grew up on them.
Yeah.
And I wrote him a letter, and he had just died after it arrived. He was. But his son wrote back, and we ended up having this correspondence for years. In fact, I'm still occasionally in touch with him. There's a writer named Bill Wallace who would do these kind of animal
all the
books.
animals, yeah. Right.
There's always a different depth. There are usually children moved to new circumstances.
Yeah.
And, he wrote back to me numerous times. So I knew what I wanted to do from a very early age.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have to work for a living. I wanted to write. Wanted to make up stories.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a great job at this job, so I'm telling you.
Thank you.
So I know after the event tonight here on the story, you're going to be meeting with a bunch of IU, Indiana
go
University,
Hoosiers, right?
yeah, alumni, and you've won a couple of alumni awards, so it's going to be great. Because, and I think a lot of them are really looking forward to seeing you tonight.
Yeah,
so
that's going to be
great.
special. I'm very
It should be really
honored
great.
by that, and hostile turf too. I mean, it's Big Ten country. The fact that you guys let me bring a bunch of Hoosiers in here is
that's right.
very generous.
Yeah. So what's next? You said something when you have a book comes out in the world and it's release day, and you are already working on the next manuscript. So
yeah, exactly.
Can you give us anything?
I can tell you the working title is "I'm Still Here," which we'll see if that lasts. It might just be the way I feel after getting a draft done, and it involves an assassin, a girl in a coma, and a disgraced race car driver. So if I can't take those elements and make this thing go,
that sounds good.
Yeah, I've got a problem.
Okay, you got us already.
And it'll be May next year.
May next year.
Yep.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me.
Oh, no. This is
and congrats on how it happened. And please come back with the next book next May.
Thank you. Anytime.
All right. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Great conversation with New York Times bestselling author Michael Koryta. Started writing when he was 19 years old. This is his 13th novel. He's only 35, and it's called How It Happened, an incredible crime thriller that will keep you reading until the very end in one sitting. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.